There are towns the maps remember, and there are towns the ground remembers. Frostveil, Vermont, is neither. It is a place the wind tries to forget. Nestled between collapsing birch forests and a half-frozen river that no longer feeds anything but silence, Frostveil in 1823 was not much more than a stitched gathering of roofs and habits, 37 families and a church that had once burned and been rebuilt, with hands trembling too hard to steady the beams. There was a sawmill. There was a graveyard. And on the third morning of November, there was Evelyn Crane, standing at the edge of that graveyard, reading her own name carved into a granite headstone. She had gone to the cemetery with a basket of dried flowers for her mother's grave. That was all. But the new stone stood crooked near the back fence, facing the sun like it expected an audience. Evelyn hadn't cried out. She had simply walked closer, dusting snow off its surface with the sleeve of her wool dress. Her fingers had gone numb before she reached the bottom inscription. Evelyn Crane, born May 4th, 1793, died. November 4th, 1823. It was November 3rd. At first, she thought it a cruel joke, a stonemason's mistake, perhaps. There were no other Evelyn Cranes in town, only her and her older sister Abigail, who had taken vows at the convent up north and hadn't returned in nearly 7 years. The townspeople were God-fearing and tight-lipped. No one had ever dared such blasphemy. Evelyn stood there for minutes that felt like hours. The sun dipped lower. The trees shivered. Somewhere far off, a crow cackled as if it knew something she didn't. When she finally turned away from the stone, she saw Sheriff Harold Price watching her from the path. He wasn't a man to smile unless it was out of politeness or pain. Tall, with a limp earned in a forgotten war and eyes that scanned every face like it might lie to him, he said only one word. "Did you order that?" She shook her head. "Then we have a problem." He walked her back to town, asking questions she could barely answer. No, she had not spoken to the gravedigger in weeks. No, she hadn't been ill. No, she hadn't made enemies. Not living ones, she said half-jokingly. Price didn't smile. The townsfolk turned their heads as they passed. Whispers swirled in the cold air like ash. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The wind scraped against the shutters like fingernails. The wood stove hissed as it settled. Around midnight, she lit a candle and returned to the cemetery, half hoping the stone would be gone, that she'd dreamt it, that the world was still rational beneath its layers of frost and fear. But the stone remained. Only now, a second object had been placed beside it. A coffin. It wasn't in the ground. It sat above it. Small pine wood, sealed, and nailed to its lid was a slip of parchment. The ink was still drying. Her name was written on it. That was the moment Evelyn began to believe. Not in ghosts or curses or evil men with too much time, but in something deeper, older, a kind of knowing that had crept up from the soil itself. She knelt beside the coffin, pressing her ear to the wood. Inside, something moved. She ran, barefoot and breathless, leaving behind the basket, the candle, her composure. When she reached Sheriff Price's door, she was weeping too hard to speak. He opened it without asking why. She heard something inside the coffin. She told him between gasps. And what she heard, whispered back. Price didn't hesitate. He fetched his lantern and coat. "What did it say?" he asked. Evelyn's voice was a whisper. It said, "We've been waiting." Sheriff Price didn't reply. He simply turned, lantern held high, and walked into the night with the measured gait of a man used to facing things that shouldn't be faced. Evelyn followed close behind, her feet wrapped hastily in wool and leather. The wind had stilled as if listening, and the moon had disappeared behind a bank of cloud that refused to move. Frostveil had no street lamps, only memory guiding the way. When they reached the cemetery gate, even the dogs had stopped barking. The pinewood coffin was still there, but now it was open. No latch had been forced, no hinges unfastened. The lid lay gently beside the box as if removed with reverence. Evelyn clutched Price's coat sleeve, trying to breathe. Inside the coffin was something worse than a body. There was nothing at all, except for a dress. Her dress, the blue one she'd worn on Easter, the one she hadn't seen since it vanished from the clothesline 6 weeks ago, folded neatly over a bundle of dried lilacs. Beneath it, on the pine slats, lay a sprig of rosemary. Evelyn let go of Price's sleeve and stepped forward, drawn by some awful tether. A thin note was pinned to the lining of the dress. Price took it before she could touch it. He read it once, face stone still, then handed it to her. The paper was stiff, creased. The handwriting was hers. In silence, we bloom. That was all. 4 words she didn't remember writing, yet she knew they were hers. She had seen that script her whole life. Signed letters, filled journals, etched thoughts into the corners of prayer books. But she had never written those words, not on paper, not aloud, not even in thought. A noise escaped her throat, something between confusion and dread. "Is someone playing with me?" she asked. Sheriff Price didn't answer. His eyes had moved to the headstone again. The date had changed. Now it read, "Died, November 5th, 1823, tomorrow." Evelyn stumbled back. It changed. It wasn't. I swear it wasn't. Price knelt down, brushing his fingers across the stone's edge. "Moss doesn't lie. This engraving is fresh." "Who would do this?" she whispered. He stood slowly. "That's what I mean to find out." They buried the coffin, not in the cemetery, but in the woods behind Price's property, where only he and Evelyn would know. Before they filled the earth, he dusted the rosemary clean and slipped it into his coat pocket. Evelyn didn't ask why. Something about it felt sacred, or cursed. And maybe those things were now the same. At dawn, Evelyn returned home, cheeks hollow from lack of sleep. Her neighbor, Mrs. Crandall, waved politely but said nothing. The townsfolk had already begun to talk, and Frostveil didn't take kindly to rumors with teeth. Inside her cottage, she bolted the door and sat at the table for hours, staring at the slip of paper. In silence, we bloom. It echoed like a hymn she had never heard, yet somehow always known. Around noon, the wind picked up again. It carried the faint scent of lilac and wood smoke. She thought of writing to Abigail, her sister in the convent. But how does one begin such a letter? "Dear sister, I found my grave. It's waiting." Instead, she folded the note and placed it in her Bible. When she did, something else fell from between the pages. Something that shouldn't have been there. A pressed lilac. Old fragile. Familiar. She hadn't touched one since her mother's funeral. She stared at it for a long while, heart pounding not with fear, but with the slow, dawning realization that the past wasn't done with her. That evening, Sheriff Price returned, face pale and hard. "I checked with the stonemason," he said. He swore he never carved that stone. Evelyn looked at him. "Then who did?" Price hesitated. "Someone using your name ordered it. Paid in full. 3 weeks ago." He held out a slip of parchment. A receipt signed in her handwriting. Evelyn did not take it. Her hands stayed rigid at her sides, fingers curling into her skirt. The candlelight flickered between them, casting long shadows across the floorboards of her parlor. Sheriff Price laid the receipt on the table gently, as if afraid it might bite. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. "I didn't sign that," Evelyn whispered. Price gave a single nod. "I believe you." But belief, in Frostveil, was a brittle currency. She sat slowly, eyes on the name at the bottom of the parchment. Her name. Her looping, deliberate script. Her unmistakable E, shaped like the ribbon her mother used to wear to church. There was no smudge, no trembling hand. Whoever had signed it had done so with full confidence. "I haven't left this town," she said, voice distant. "I haven't been anywhere near Holloway Stoneworks in years." Price took a deep breath and lit his pipe, the scent of tobacco rising like incense between them. That receipt was dated October 12th. Paid in full, cash. He remembers you clear as day. Said you wore a grey shawl and asked for it to be delivered quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "I don't own a grey shawl." Price tapped ash into the fireplace. "You do now." Evelyn flinched. "What?" "I found one," he said. "Folded over the back of the church pew where you sit. It's yours now, or someone wants it to be." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping wood like a blade against stone. "I want it out of my house." "You don't understand," Price said softly. "This isn't someone tormenting you. This is someone becoming you." That night, Evelyn dreamed of mirrors. Every wall in her home was lined with them, none reflecting her face. They showed a woman with her shape, her posture, her sorrow, but not her soul. The eyes were colder, the lips more certain. In the dream, she begged the reflections to stop. One by one, they smiled. She woke at dawn, drenched in sweat, only to find a mirror on her nightstand she did not own. It had not been there the night before. Small, oval, framed in silver and frost-kissed like it had come from the woods themselves. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked it up. The glass was clouded, smeared from the inside. Beneath it, in fine script etched into the frame, "Return what was borrowed." She dropped it. The mirror cracked clean down the middle, splitting her reflection in two. At noon, Price returned. He looked older than he had the day before. Tired in the way only men who no longer sleep can be tired. He held a letter. From Sister Abigail. Evelyn's breath hitched. "You wrote her?" "She wrote me," he said. "Arrived this morning, addressed to me directly, postmarked from Brattleboro, but the convent's seal was real." Evelyn took the envelope with trembling hands. The parchment was aged, brittle. She read in silence. "Dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means the bloom has begun. I prayed we would be spared this cycle, but frost always returns, and so must the vessel. You must not run. You must remember, and above all, do not go near the well. Abigail." "What bloom?" Evelyn asked aloud. Price answered quietly. "I think your sister knows something we don't." She looked at him with hollow eyes. "She knew it before I found the stone." He nodded once. "And that means this didn't start with you." There was a long silence. Evelyn's thoughts spiraled around a single word in the letter. Vessel. What does she mean? "Return what was borrowed," she asked. Price hesitated. "Maybe you borrowed a life that wasn't entirely yours." Evelyn looked away. Outside, the wind stirred the snow in small whirls across the windowsill. The air had a bitter bite to it. "I need to see her," she said. "You can't." "Why not?" He stared into the fire. "Abigail Crane died in 1820. Evelyn felt the words move through her like cold water. The room, the fire, the sheriff, all seemed to recede behind a curtain of silence that fell without warning. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as though another voice inside her wanted to speak but couldn't. "You're wrong," she said at last, the words tasting unfamiliar in her throat. "That letter came today." Price nodded solemnly. "I saw the seal, I saw the date, I saw the handwriting, but I also saw her grave. I was there when they buried her." Evelyn stepped back as if trying to outrun the implications. "No. She left for the convent. She never came back. I would have known." Price's voice was quiet, but firm. "She never arrived." "Word came from the convent that she was ill. She died en route. You were told she stayed, that she had taken final vows, but there was no burial ceremony for you to attend. Your parents never spoke of it again." "No one did." Evelyn felt her knees weaken. Why wouldn't they tell me? Maybe they wanted to protect you. Maybe she asked them not to. That last line lingered. The air inside the room turned heavy, too thick to breathe. She sat, the edge of the chair creaking beneath her, the cracked mirror still lying on the floor like a wound that wouldn't heal. I remember her, she whispered. Her voice, her songs, her stories. And now she writes letters from a convent she never reached. Price said, standing. We need to find that well. Evelyn's head snapped up. What well? The one she warned you about. There's only one I know of that fits the letter's tone. Crane's Hollow. Your family's land. Your father sealed it after your mother died. I was 9, Evelyn murmured. He said it wasn't safe, that the wood around it had rotted. Price's brow furrowed. What else do you remember? Nothing, she said too quickly. Then more slowly. That I wasn't allowed to speak Abigail's name for a year. That every time I cried, someone whispered, "Not yet," near my room, but no one was there. That night, beneath the frost-bitten moonlight, Price and Evelyn crossed the thinning birch trees toward what had once been the Crane estate. The house was long gone, collapsed under snow and years, but the stone path remained, worn and crooked like a forgotten spine. They found the well surrounded by thorny underbrush, its stone lip covered with a rusted iron grate bolted shut. Evelyn reached toward it instinctively, but Price stopped her. "Let me," he said. He knelt, brushed aside dead leaves, and pried open the old lock with a tool from his belt. It groaned but gave way. He lifted the grate. Evelyn peered into the darkness. At first, she saw only shadows. Then, something deeper than shadow, shapes, pale and slow, floating just beneath the surface. A reflection twisted wrong, and a voice. It was unmistakably Abigail's. "Evelyn," it called softly. "You wore the blue dress." Evelyn stumbled backward, striking her head against a tree trunk. The world tilted sideways. When she looked again, Price was gone. The lantern lay on its side, still burning. She called out once, twice. No answer. The forest held its breath. She turned back to the well. A second voice joined the first, her own. "You wrote the letter," it said. "You sent yourself the warning." Evelyn clutched her chest. Her heart was racing, wild and uneven. She stepped closer, against every instinct, and whispered, "Who are you?" The voices in the well answered in unison. "We are what you left behind." A breeze rose suddenly, sharp and foul, lifting her hair and slicing through her clothes. The trees creaked like bones shifting, and from within the well, something began to climb. Evelyn turned and ran, not looking back, not even when she heard her name spoken from the darkness behind her, in her own voice. The trees blurred past in pale streaks, branches clawing at her sleeves, mud and frost tearing her shoes apart as she fled. Each step felt too slow, like the ground was pulling her down. The forest no longer seemed like trees and trail, but a vast mouth closing in. Her lungs burned, her heartbeat echoed in her skull. Only when she reached the edge of Frostveil's town border, where the church bell tower rose like a cold finger pointing to heaven, did she stop. She collapsed onto the stone steps of the church, scraping her hands, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Her breath came in gasps, but the silence behind her held. Whatever had stirred in the well hadn't followed. Yet, the church doors creaked open, and there stood Reverend Mallory, candle in hand, face drawn as if he too had seen something he couldn't explain. He said nothing at first, just looked at her, blinking slowly like trying to remember which version of her he was seeing. "They said you'd come here," he said softly. "In the old stories." Evelyn blinked through the tears. "What stories?" He gestured her inside. "Ones I never preached." Inside, the chapel was empty. No candles lit the altar, no hymn books on the pews. The windows had been boarded months ago after a storm shattered the glass, but it felt like the boards had been there longer, as though the building had given up on light. Evelyn sat near the front, trying to quiet the sound of her own breathing. "Tell me what you know," she said. "All of it." Reverend Mallory took a long time to respond. When he finally spoke, it was in a tone neither pastoral nor academic, but regretful. Abigail was here. Evelyn, not alive. But she came back. The winter after her death, your father brought something home from her grave. I never saw it, but he locked the chapel for 7 weeks. Wouldn't let me in. Said the Lord was testing him, that she had whispered instructions from beyond. I thought he was grieving. Evelyn closed her eyes. "And the well?" He nodded. "He built the grate himself, said it would keep what remained from climbing, said it would come for the next daughter if the bloom ever returned." Evelyn's fingers dug into the pew. Bloom. Abigail used that word. "She would," Mallory said. "It's older than scripture. In the town records, the first Evelyn Crane was buried in 1723. And in 1823, you were born." A chill ran down her spine. 100 years exactly. Mallory turned away. There's always been an Evelyn, every 100 years, always with a sister who dies early, always something buried that tries to bloom again. But how can that be? His voice trembled. Some say it's the land, others say your bloodline made a pact. But I believe you're not Evelyn Crane. She stood. What? You're the vessel, just like the last, just like the next. Something borrowed your life. Now it wants it back. Evelyn backed toward the door, but the wind howled outside loud and sudden. A shutter cracked against the wall. Something moved in the shadows behind the pulpit. Then a voice echoed through the chapel. Deep, doubled, familiar. You wore the blue dress. It wasn't just inside the church. It was under it. Evelyn spun toward Mallory. "What is beneath us?" He didn't move. "Tell me." "Stone," he whispered, "and soil, and Abigail." A groan erupted from below the floorboards, long and wet like wood breaking under pressure. "Run," he whispered. "You have until dawn. After that..." He didn't finish. Because the floor behind the altar collapsed inward, and from the dark hole rose the unmistakable scent of lilacs and decay. Evelyn didn't scream. Screaming would have made it real, and some small part of her still clung to the hope that she was asleep in her bed, caught in a fevered dream stitched from grief and coincidence. But the scent filled her lungs, clung to her skin. It was the smell from her childhood bedroom the day after her mother's funeral, when she'd found lilacs beneath her pillow. It was the smell from the broken mirror, from the coffin, from the well. Familiar, intimate, rot-wearing perfume. Reverend Mallory stood motionless, eyes locked on the yawning hole behind the altar. A cold wind had begun to rise from it, as if the church itself were exhaling. Evelyn took one step back, then another. A low groan echoed again beneath the floorboards, longer, louder, joined now by what sounded like breath, shallow, rhythmic. Something was climbing, slowly, deliberately, and it knew they were waiting. "We can't stay," Evelyn whispered. "We have to go." But Mallory didn't move. His eyes were wet. She came to me. In the dark, for weeks, I thought she was only a voice. I thought I was chosen. But she was hungry. Evelyn grabbed his arm. "Please." His gaze didn't leave the hole. "She said I would open the door." Evelyn turned and ran, slamming the chapel doors behind her, racing down the hill, across the frost-bitten dirt road, past the silent houses of Frostveil. No one stirred, not a single window lit. It was as if the town had fallen into a shared sleep, or a pact of silence. As she neared her cottage, she saw the front door standing open. Inside, the fire was still burning, and someone was sitting in her chair. For a moment, she thought it was Price. Then the figure turned its head, and she knew she was wrong. The face that looked up at her was her own, but not her as she was now. No, it was her face as it had been at 17, hair longer, cheeks softer, eyes unscarred by grief. The double smiled and stood. "Welcome home," it said. Evelyn didn't move. "You've come so far," the thing continued. "You've remembered just enough, but not the rest." "I don't know you," Evelyn said hoarsely. "You knew me first." The double stepped forward, barefoot on the wooden floorboards, leaving no sound behind. "We shared the same blood, the same cradle song. You are the bloom, I am the root." Evelyn's hands trembled. "Where is Sheriff Price?" The thing tilted its head. "You buried him, don't you remember?" "No, you will." A loud creak sounded from the back of the house. Another figure emerged from the shadows. Abigail, but younger, glowing, whole. She held a bundle in her arms, wrapped in linen. Evelyn stepped forward, unwilling, compelled by something deeper than curiosity. "What is that?" she asked. Her sister smiled. "You were always the quieter one." She placed the bundle gently on the table and unwrapped it. Inside was a mirror, the same silver-framed glass Evelyn had broken days earlier, but now restored, polished, shining. The reflection that stared back from the glass was not Evelyn, nor the double, nor Abigail. It was their mother. Her lips moved inside the mirror. "Finish what I started." The candle on the table extinguished without warning. The room plunged into darkness. The scent of lilacs grew stronger, almost choking. Evelyn gasped and stumbled back. When the lights flickered again, she was alone. The mirror sat on the floor. The bundle was gone, and the wind outside had changed direction, blowing not from the north or west, but up from the ground beneath her. She fell to her knees, trembling. Something inside her memory was loosening, cracking open. There had been another girl. Not Abigail, not her, a third, a name she had forgotten. Until now, she whispered it aloud. Maribel. And the house shuddered like it remembered too. The name rang through Evelyn's bones with a familiarity so ancient it felt inherited rather than remembered. Not a friend, not a sister, something else. A missing limb, a silence in the shape of a girl. She sat frozen on the floor of her cottage as the floorboards groaned softly beneath her, no longer in protest of age, but as if bracing for a weight long promised. She had never said the name before, yet it had always been there, hovering just beyond language, woven into lullabies, sewn into the hem of old dresses, scratched faintly into the inside of a childhood music box. The wind outside shrieked once and then vanished. In its absence, Evelyn felt something settle. Not peace, not calm, something worse. The certainty that the night had crossed into a threshold it would not return from. She rose slowly, candlelight flickering around her. The mirror on the floor reflected her now empty face. No sorrow, no confusion, just the stillness of inevitability. Her hands moved on their own. She lit a second candle, then a third. She opened a drawer, removed a long-forgotten iron key wrapped in red ribbon. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. It was time to return to the cellar beneath the ruins of her childhood home. Outside, the snow had started again, not in flakes, but in ash-colored dust that didn't melt upon contact. The air had turned sour, metallic. As Evelyn made her way toward the tree line, each step seemed to echo louder than the last, like something was mimicking her pace from beneath the earth. At the edge of the Crane property, she stopped. The well stood silent, the grate still open, but she didn't go to it. Instead, she turned toward the barn, or rather, what had once been the barn. The skeletal remains of beams reached upward like burnt ribs. The roof long collapsed, but the stone cellar door at the far end was intact. The ribbon around the key unwound itself in her palm. She descended the 5 moss-slicked steps, At the base was the door, black iron hinges, a handle worn smooth by hands that had no names. She placed the key in the lock and turned. It opened without resistance. The air inside was colder than the snow, a darkness so thick it felt like breath held for centuries. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Not slammed, just closed. Respectfully. The candle flickered in protest. The cellar was empty, just stone walls and silence. But as she moved forward, her candlelight caught something on the far wall. Words, dozens of them carved deep into the stone, layer upon layer, a palimpsest of desperate hands. Each line bore a name. Evelyn Crane, Abigail Crane, Maribel Crane, Evelyn Crane, Evelyn Crane, Evelyn Crane. Over and over, in different hands, different depths, stretching back decades, centuries, all ending in the same phrase. She bloomed too early. A scraping noise echoed behind her. She turned. At the center of the cellar now stood a cradle. Not there before. Pale wood, threadbare linens. Inside, something moved under the blanket. Small. Shifting. Evelyn stepped closer. A note was pinned to the edge of the cradle. It read, "You returned. So must she." She pulled back the blanket. There was no baby, only a mirror, tiny oval, framed in iron this time, not silver. Her reflection was missing. Instead, Maribel stared back, but not as a child. Older, hollow-eyed, lips stained dark with dirt, and smiling. Evelyn dropped the mirror, but it didn't break. It landed softly, as if the earth below had been expecting it. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered from the shadows. The third was buried beneath the others. "You took her breath. Now she takes yours." And the candle went out. Evelyn stood frozen in the pitch dark of the cellar, pulse roaring in her ears, throat tightened against the rising scream. She dared not move. Darkness this complete had no edges, no ceiling, no floor. It was a kind of weight pressing in from all sides. Her breathing, now ragged and shallow, was the only sound. Until it wasn't. A whisper stirred in the corner. Not a word, a breath, then another, then two more. Something was breathing with her. She fumbled for the candle, hands sweeping across the cold stone floor, praying her fingers would meet wax and not flesh. Her hand grazed the mirror, still intact, still cold, and finally found the candle. She struck the flint. Once, twice. The spark caught. Light returned in a narrow halo and revealed footprints, small, bare, leading away from the cradle toward the far wall, but there was no door there, only stone. Evelyn followed the prints slowly. The closer she came, the louder the breath behind her grew. It was not hers now. It belonged to something larger, hungrier. She reached the wall. There, faint under centuries of grime and soot, was an arch carved into the stone. A false seam, a forgotten door, and above it, one word etched in elegant, meticulous script. Remember. The candle flickered violently in her hand. A voice rose from the ground behind her, not Abigail's, not Maribel's, her own. You promised her silence. Evelyn turned and saw the cellar full. Figures stood in the shadows. Dozens, all Evelyns, different ages, different centuries, some in mourning dresses, some in wedding gowns, one in a nurse's apron stained with something brown. They watched her, unspeaking, eyes hollow and knowing. She turned slowly, heart pounding, candle trembling. One of them stepped forward. She was younger, maybe 16, pale, bruised wrists. Her lips moved without sound, but Evelyn understood. We forgot her, and then they were gone, as if they had never been. Only the door remained, and the mirror on the cradle. She picked it up, and this time her reflection had returned, but it was wrong. The eyes looked older than hers, too old, as if they had seen centuries, as if they belonged to someone who had died too many times and still remembered each one. With shaking hands, Evelyn touched the stone where the hidden door lay, cold, solid, but something behind it pulsed, not with life, but with memory. She pressed harder. It gave way. The door opened. Inside was not a room, it was a stairwell, spiraling down into earth, packed tighter than stone, darker than ink, airless as a sealed tomb. She descended without knowing why. Perhaps she was no longer Evelyn. Perhaps Evelyn had always been walking toward this moment. Each step took something from her: memory, breath, warmth. At the bottom, the stairs ended at a chamber, lit with no flame but glowing with a soft blue haze that came from the walls themselves. In the center stood 3 caskets. Stone, identical, each engraved with a name: Abigail Crane, Evelyn Crane, Maribel Crane. The lids were sealed, but not tight. Beside them, a book lay open on a pedestal of bone. She stepped closer. The text was written in a script she didn't know, yet read fluently, as if someone had etched it directly into her brain long ago. The blood remembers, the bloom obeys, the breath returns, the root must feed. Below that, a single line written in her own hand. "Forgive me, Maribel." Evelyn stared at it, realization blooming behind her eyes like rot through wood. She had written this. Not now, not recently. Another time, another version of herself. The air grew colder. The lid of Maribel's casket cracked just an inch, enough to breathe. And from inside came the faint sound of a lullaby. Sung in a voice that used to be hers, Evelyn staggered backward, the melody threading through the chamber like a spider's web, delicate but impossible to escape. She knew the tune. Every note carved itself into the marrow of her memory. It was the song her mother had sung during storms, the one she thought had no words, only humming. But now, beneath the ground, the words revealed themselves, and they weren't comforting. The bloom must wake before the frost. The root must drink what love has lost. The breath returns. The veil shall fall. She speaks the name. And so they call. The air in the chamber thickened, and Evelyn dropped to one knee, clutching her chest. It felt as though something was moving inside her, not just fear, but knowledge. Awakened knowledge. Inherited like a curse or an unfinished letter never burned. The stone casket bearing her name trembled. Dust sifted from its edges. The lid moved half an inch, then another. The sound was not loud, but it filled the room, a grinding, ancient groan like old teeth chewing bone. "No," Evelyn gasped. "No, that's not." The lid stopped, but only because the one on Abigail's tomb had begun. She looked to the pedestal, to the book of bone. Her own handwriting glared back at her, fresh now, as if just written. She reached toward it, compelled, and as her fingers touched the page, the letters burned bright red. A flash of memory stabbed her skull. 3 girls in a circle, Maribel coughing blood, Abigail weeping, herself, younger, chanting something over a cracked mirror, and a knife. She screamed, not from the pain, but from the recognition. They hadn't buried Maribel. They had offered her the bloom, the breath, the vessel. She had taken her sister's name, her sister's place, her sister's breath, all of it in exchange for... She staggered upright. "No," she whispered to the tombs. "You're not supposed to wake. You were promised sleep." The stone beneath her feet rippled like water. From the cracks in the chamber's corners, small white flowers began to bloom. Lilacs, impossibly alive in a place without sun. Their scent was no longer nostalgic. It was suffocating. Behind her, the spiral stairwell vanished. The chamber had closed. The 3 caskets began to pulse. Abigail's lid opened fully, and there she was. Not as Evelyn remembered her. Not dead. Not quite alive. Abigail's face was serene, eyes open, hair braided in the funeral style of Frostveil's oldest rites. Her hands were folded over her chest, and between them was the iron-framed mirror. This one reflected nothing, just darkness. Abigail's lips moved. Evelyn leaned in. "She was never the youngest," Abigail whispered. Then her eyes closed again. A gust of air swirled around Evelyn, and the flowers burst into flame. Violet fire, no heat, only sound, like singing. Maribel's casket cracked wider, and Evelyn saw fingers, thin, gray, dirt-caked, moving. She turned to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber had no door now, no exit. Only one wall glowed faintly. Behind it, another shape, vague and shifting. A doorway. She ran to it, pressing her hand against the wall. It felt like skin, and then it opened. Not onto the woods, but into her own house. She was back in her cottage, same room, same furniture. Only it wasn't night, it was morning, and someone was humming the lullaby behind her. She turned slowly. A child sat at the table, 8 years old, maybe 9. Holding the mirror, she looked up and smiled. "Did you forget me again?" she asked. The child was Maribel, and she had Evelyn's eyes, not just the color or the shape. No, she had the gaze Evelyn saw in her own reflection when no one else was watching. That quiet sorrow behind every breath, the weight of knowing more than one lifetime's worth of loss. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was duplication. In that moment, Evelyn understood. This child wasn't Maribel reborn, she was Evelyn undone. "What are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice nearly a whisper. Maribel tilted her head. "Don't you know?" The mirror in her hands shimmered, not with light, but with memory. The surface showed a moving image. Evelyn as a child, standing in the woods behind the Crane estate, a bundle of flowers in her arms. She looked frightened. Behind her, 2 girls, Abigail and Maribel, stood in a circle of stones, one crying, one chanting. Evelyn blinked. That's not how it happened. Maribel's voice turned softer. It's how it began. The candle on the windowsill flickered violently. The shadows in the room elongated, forming narrow figures that stood motionless near the walls. Silent witnesses. "You were sick," Evelyn said aloud, watching the memory unfold in the mirror. "Maribel, you couldn't breathe. You coughed blood for weeks." The child didn't speak. "And I," Evelyn's voice cracked. "I said the prayer, the one from the book in the cellar." Maribel smiled faintly. "You wanted to save me." "I didn't know," Evelyn whispered. "I didn't know what it would take." The shadows moved now, just slightly, pulsing in time with the girl's breath. "You offered your name," Maribel said. "Your place, your breath, but not your soul. You kept that for yourself." The room grew colder. The mirror darkened. Evelyn stepped back. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come back?" Maribel rose from the chair. "Because it's November 5th, she said. "The day you said I'd sleep forever." Evelyn's heart thudded. The date on the gravestone. The date she'd found weeks ago. Her own death carved in stone, but not hers. Maribel walked toward her, small feet bare against the wooden floor. "You marked the stone, Evelyn. You etched it. You wrote the note. You folded the dress." Evelyn backed away. "No, I don't remember. You do," the child said firmly. "You just chose to forget." The mirror in her hands began to weep. Slow streams of black liquid trickling down its surface like tears made of ink. The scent of lilacs returned, but now it burned in her throat. Evelyn stumbled, reaching for the door, but it no longer led outside. It opened onto the chapel again, collapsed, buried, frozen. "You buried me under stories," Maribel whispered. "But roots remember, and now the frost returns." The mirror shattered in her hands, not with sound, but with silence. All noise vanished. No wind, no breath, no heartbeat. Evelyn stood paralyzed. Around her, the shadows began to peel from the walls. They drifted toward her in slow, solemn procession. All wore her face, all bore the scars of a different ending, one with no eyes, one whose mouth was sewn shut, one cradling a bundle wrapped in blue. All silent, all Evelyn, and in the center, Maribel's voice echoed in the absence of sound. There was no bloom without a cost. The shadows reached her, encircling her slowly, their hands not touching but hovering near. The air was thick with memory. Evelyn looked into the child's face one last time. "What do you want from me?" Maribel's reply was almost kind. Only what was promised. The shadows closed in, and Evelyn's voice, once her own, echoed from the broken pieces of the mirror. She remembered. She returned. She was never alone. The room blinked out, and only the cradle remained. It sat in the center of the room, untouched, unmoved, as if the last hour hadn't happened, as if no shadows had passed through, no mirror shattered, no child with Evelyn's eyes had whispered forgotten truths. The silence around it was absolute, humming with the kind of stillness that comes only after something irreversible has occurred. Evelyn didn't remember falling, but she awoke lying on the floor beside the cradle, head resting against its side. Her fingers were curled tightly around something small and cold, the iron key wrapped in the red ribbon. She sat up slowly. The room was not her cottage anymore. Stone walls, damp earth, the cellar, but not the one she had entered before. This one was older. No candlelight now, just the faint blue luminescence from the moss on the walls. The air tasted like dust and lilacs and old breath. She looked down at the cradle. It was empty, except for the mirror, whole again, shining, and next to it, a letter. Evelyn unfolded the paper. The handwriting was her own. "Dearest self, if you are reading this, then you've followed the path as I once did. There is no end, only returning, only remembering. We made her sleep once, we must do it again, but the price must be paid in full. You were the breath, Abigail was the bloom, and Maribel was the seed. Some things do not stay buried, not even time." Evelyn stared at the words until they blurred. The sound of crying drifted up from the floorboards, a child's cry, not loud, but ragged, not a newborn, not a ghost, a memory, but not hers. She rose, unsteady, and followed the sound. It led her down a narrow tunnel carved into the stone. Each step took her deeper. She passed roots that moved slightly as she brushed them. Whispers returned, too soft to understand, but steady as breath. She reached a wooden door bound in iron, same as before. This time it was already open. Inside, a chamber she did not remember stood waiting. 3 chairs, 3 mirrors, 3 dresses, each placed with care. Blue, white, black. At the far end, a wall of carvings, not names, faces, hundreds of them, weathered, some half erased, but all bearing the same symmetry. 3 girls, always 3, always one missing her mouth, one missing her eyes, one with nothing missing at all. A soft voice behind her. "You have to choose again." She turned and saw herself, not a shadow, not a reflection, but Evelyn as she had been before the bloom. Stronger, unbroken, terrified. "You can take her place," the other said. "You always did." Evelyn backed away. "I'm not doing this again." "But you are," the other said, "because you never stopped. Every time you forget, the cycle resets, and she climbs closer to the surface." Maribel. She was never meant to bloom. The mirror in the center cracked. The cry of the child returned, closer now. The Evelyn standing before her lifted the black dress and held it out. It's the only way to put her back. "I won't bury her again. She's not the one who gets buried." The chamber shook violently. Roots tore through the wall. The 3 mirrors shattered at once, and from beneath the stone floor, fingers clawed upward, small, pale, dirt-covered. The other, Evelyn whispered. You promised her silence, you gave her breath, but you never gave her voice. Then she vanished. Evelyn stood alone, and the child's cry became a scream. From within the cradle, Maribel's voice rose one final time. She remembers now. She remembers everything. And Evelyn did. The lullabies were not songs. They were incantations. The mirror was not glass. It was a tether. The grave was never meant to hold Maribel. It was meant to hold what Maribel became. She had not died in sickness, not in innocence. She had been made into something eternal, something buried not beneath stone, but beneath silence. A silence Evelyn herself had stitched shut with her forgetting. Now the stitches had ruptured. Evelyn stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by crawling roots and broken mirrors, each shard reflecting a different face, a different fate. The chairs lay toppled, the dresses turned to ash. The carvings on the walls bled slowly, not blood, but ink-black sap, weeping from the eyes of every etched face. She took a breath, steadying herself. The floor bulged, fingers pushed up from the stone, more than before, thick now, joined by arms, elbows, shoulders. A figure clawed its way from the earth. It was not Maribel, it was not Abigail, it was something else entirely, yet made from pieces of them both. Long black hair matted with soil, eyes milky with knowing, lips sewn shut but trembling. It stood before Evelyn and tilted its head. She recognized it at last. Not a ghost, not a girl, but the kept promise. The thing created when a breath was borrowed and never returned. It reached out a hand. Evelyn didn't recoil. You want your voice, she said. The figure nodded. Evelyn stepped closer. What happens if I give it back? The figure turned to the nearest mirror shard. It reflected a version of Evelyn that was blind, screaming in a room of fire. Then another, silent, walking through a snow-covered town as bells tolled backwards. A third, kneeling before a cradle in the middle of a forest clearing, her mouth sewn shut. Evelyn understood. Not endings, choices. Every Evelyn before her had failed by fleeing, by forgetting. She had tried to run, she had tried to bury, but this time, she remembered. She held out her hand. The figure hesitated, then slowly placed its sewn fingers in Evelyn's palm. A warmth passed between them. Old, aching, the breath of centuries drawn into a single exhale. Evelyn whispered, Maribel. The stitches across the figure's mouth unraveled one by one, dissolving into mist. Its lips parted and she spoke. Her voice was quiet, soft as a memory. Thank you. The roots withdrew into the walls. The ink on the carvings dried. The air cleared, sharp with frost, but absent of decay. Light filtered in through the cracks above. The chamber ceased trembling. Maribel looked at her, and for the first time, Evelyn saw her as she had been, not as a symbol or a punishment, but a sister. The sister she had loved, the sister she had lost, and the sister she had become. Maribel stepped back toward the cradle, her form flickering faintly now, less solid, more memory than presence. She reached into the cradle and pulled the mirror from within. She offered it to Evelyn. It's yours now, she said. Evelyn took it. The glass showed no reflection, only an empty room. A lullaby played once more, but this time it came from the walls, from the roots, from the breath of the earth itself. It sounded like rain falling in rhythm, like names being remembered aloud. Maribel turned away, stepping into the cradle not as a girl, but as light, and vanished. Evelyn stood alone. The mirror in her hands pulsed once, then grew still. Behind her, the stone doorway reopened, and far in the distance, bells began to toll. But they were not funeral bells. They were the kind rung when something buried is finally at rest. Evelyn climbed the spiral path back toward the surface, the mirror clutched tightly in her hand. The cold had lessened, but not disappeared. The air tasted clearer now, like the first breath after a long fever. Still, nothing above had changed. The town of Frostveil remained wrapped in silence. The trees held their breath. No birds, no wind, no sign of dawn. She emerged beside the old barn ruins, the sky overhead a pale bruise of fading stars. She turned back to the earth. The cellar was gone. No trace of the door, the stairs, the chamber. Only hard-packed soil marked where the path had once been. She crouched down, ran her fingers across it. Smooth, unbroken, as if no one had ever stood there, no one had ever screamed, and no one had ever forgotten. But she knew. She remembered, and memory, now, was everything. She walked back toward the cottage, the frost crunching softly beneath her steps. Every window she passed held its breath. The chapel's steeple leaned quietly in the distance, neither inviting nor warning. She reached her home. The door stood open, exactly as she had left it, but something inside had shifted. It felt lighter. Inside, the fire had gone out, but the room was warm. She placed the mirror on the table and lit a single candle. The flame flickered, but held. Across the room sat the cradle, still empty, still whole. The note that had once rested there was gone. The child's voice no longer echoed through the timbers. Evelyn moved to the mirror. This time, her reflection was whole. Not young, not old, just present. For the first time, she did not look away. A knock sounded at the door. Soft, steady. She opened it. Sheriff Harold Price stood there, covered in frost, eyes wide with disbelief. "I thought you were gone." Evelyn nodded. "I was." He looked past her, into the house. "It's morning, you know that." She stepped aside, allowing him in. He moved cautiously, eyes scanning the room as if it might vanish. He stopped before the mirror, saw his own face, and stepped back. "I dreamed of the well," he said. "Of Abigail. Of a girl I don't remember." Evelyn placed her hand gently on his arm. "You do? You just never said her name." Price sat at the table, face pale. "You think it's over?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she retrieved a book from the hearth, her father's old journal. She hadn't dared open it in years. Until now, inside were pages she'd never seen. Maps of the cellar, rights copied from older sources, names, hundreds of them, Crane's, daughters, sisters, always 3. She turned to the final page. 3 signatures: Abigail, Crane, Maribel, Crane, Evelyn Crane. Beneath them, bound by breath, broken by silence, redeemed by memory. She looked at Harold. "It's not over," she said, "but it's remembered." He stood. "What do we do now?" She thought for a moment, then whispered, "We leave the ground alone." Outside, the sun began to rise. Thin gray light spilled through the frost-covered trees. The air shimmered faintly, like breath finally exhaled after holding it too long. She stepped outside and turned toward the cemetery hill. There, in the center of the frost-covered graves, one headstone stood newer than the rest. Evelyn Crane. Born April 23rd, 1823. Died November 5th, 1823. Except the last date was gone, scraped clean, just smooth stone where death had been. Evelyn touched the edge of it, and somewhere far below, in roots deeper than memory, something sighed. Not in pain, not in rage, but in rest. She turned back toward the cottage, and for a moment saw a child's figure in the trees. Small, still, smiling. Maribel. Just watching, just remembering. Evelyn didn't move. She let the silence stretch between them, like a thread that couldn't be severed. The child at the tree line did not wave, did not speak, did not blink, just stood there, the hem of her white dress fluttering gently in a wind Evelyn could not feel. Then, without turning, Maribel stepped backward into the woods and disappeared. Evelyn stood motionless for several seconds more. her breath forming slow clouds in the morning frost. There was no fear, only the stillness of something complete. But still, something lingered. She returned to the cottage and sat at the table where Harold had left his gloves. The mirror still lay where she'd placed it. It no longer pulsed, no longer wept. Its surface now bore nothing but her own reflection, and behind her, only empty walls. She opened her father's journal again. This time, she turned not to the pages of rites and etchings, but to a small flap she had always ignored. Tucked inside was a second, older book, hand-bound, worn soft with age. She hadn't known it existed. On the first page, a title, The Sister's Account, Frostveil, 1743. She froze. 80 years before her birth, the first entry was written in a hand far more elegant than her father's. We took the breath willingly. The blood was thin by then, but the seed remained strong. The handwriting belonged to someone named Evelyn Crane. The next entry came 10 years later, written by Margaret Crane, then Honora Crane, 30 years after that. All women, all bearing the same burden. She flipped through the brittle pages, heart thudding with each passing generation. In each, 3 names. In each, one that always vanished part way through the entries. Always the youngest. Always the bloom. But in none of them was the bloom named Maribel. Maribel wasn't a sister passed down. Maribel was the name each generation gave the thing they buried, the sacrificial root. It wasn't just her family. It was a covenant. Broken now, maybe, but once carefully kept. Evelyn whispered the names aloud as if reciting a litany. Eloise, Margaret, Honora, Abigail, Evelyn. She paused. There was no third name in her generation. Not truly, not anymore. She was the breath. She was the bloom. She had become the seed. Outside, the wind changed direction. The trees groaned, not in protest, but in memory, like old bones shifting under the weight of recognition. Evelyn closed the book. She now knew why the mirror had returned unbroken, because it wasn't a trap. It was an invitation, a witness, a vessel. And now it waited for the next. She rose, took it gently, and carried it to the edge of the woods. There, beneath the stone that once bore her death date, she dug. Not deep, just enough to bury something meant for remembrance. She placed the mirror into the earth and whispered, "Not forgotten, not erased, only laid down." As she covered it, the frost melted around her hands. The soil, cold as it was, pulsed once beneath her fingers like a heartbeat, then fell still. She stood and turned. The wind carried a whisper through the trees, not hers, not Maribel's. A new voice, a child, unfamiliar, soft. "Will you remember me too?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked back toward the house and lit every candle inside, not for light, but so the shadows would know. She was not afraid. She kept the journal on the table, open to the first page, and for the first time in Frostveil's long, haunted memory, the night passed without song. Because the names were spoken, because the roots had rested. But still, there was one more page to turn. Evelyn sat by the window as twilight stretched long fingers across Frostveil's frost-bitten hills. Her hands, still cold from the burial, rested gently on the old leather cover of the Crane ledger. The journal, the mirror, the cellar, they were behind her now, but something remained open in the marrow of her bones, something still listening. She flipped the final page. It was blank. No words, no ink, but not empty. The surface shimmered faintly in the candlelight, as if beneath its fibers a memory pulsed, too deep to see, too old to name. Evelyn drew a breath. She took a quill, dipped it in ink, and placed the tip against the page. But her hand would not move, because writing meant sealing, and sealing meant beginning again. She leaned back and looked at the ceiling. The wood beams overhead had once seemed oppressive. Now they felt sacred. each knot, each nail, a witness to what had unfolded. The cradle still sat by the fire, empty, but not abandoned. Evelyn rose, placed the journal on the mantel, and stepped outside into the brittle night air. The stars had returned, clear, sharp, unafraid. She walked to the old cemetery on the hill. Each step over the frost-laced grass hummed softly, like footsteps on memory. The headstones loomed around her, ancient and askew, some names still legible, others long claimed by moss and rot. She found the one that bore hers, still blank where death once was. She stood before it, not in defiance, not in grief, but in witness. "I know what I am now," she whispered. No wind answered, but the air listened. She placed her hand on the stone, not to reclaim, not to undo, but to acknowledge. For every Evelyn before her, for every Maribel never named, for every Abigail who stood watch. She returned home just as the frost began to lift. Inside, the fire had lit itself. The journal remained open, and beside it, where no hand had placed it, sat a second book. New blank, she opened it, and this time she wrote, not rituals, not names, but a letter. To the one who comes next, you may not remember yet. You may not know the path that brought you here. But trust this, what you carry is not a curse. It is a memory. It is breath. It is the sound of a name spoken when no one else remembers. It is love buried beneath fear. And now, it is yours. When she finished, she signed not her name, but the name she had once buried, Maribel Crane. The moment the ink dried, the candles around her flickered once and steadied, and outside, from deep within the woods, the lilacs bloomed again, no longer blooming to mourn, but to witness, to continue. At dawn, Evelyn left Frostveil. She carried nothing but the new book and the name she now wore without shame. As she crossed the threshold of the old bridge, she looked back only once. The house stood quiet, but the chimney smoked gently. A promise held, a cycle ended, and somewhere, far down the line of time, a girl not yet born would walk the same path, would find the mirror, would ask the question, and this time, the answer would be waiting. Because Evelyn had written it down, because the breath had returned, because the root had fed, and because, finally, the bloom had chosen to live.